Oh, that's a dramatic start. My time has been going in your introduction. I'm going to take that back. Hello, thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone. That's a lovely introduction. That's very kind, Stefan. So yes, hello. If you are still coming in, come on in. Don't be shy. Find a seat. I won't be distracted. As Stefan says, my name is Phil Hawksworth. I don't think we're going to have time for Q&A. I'm going to squeeze in as much as I can into this session. So if you do have questions, by all means, come and grab me afterwards, or you can tweet them at me. I'm always very happy to get questions and have discussions on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my name, so that I don't forget it. You'll have to work a little bit harder, but there it is. It's at Phil Hawksworth. So just a tiny bit of background about me. So I used to work, my very first job was working, doing real-time financial data distribution, kind of putting numbers on screens for traders on the stock exchange, so my clients kind of look like this. And then after that, I kind of worked in a different environment, working in the exotic world of shipping insurance, building infrastructure and building tooling for an insurance company where my clients look more like this. And then after working at a telecoms company, I found my way to agencies, where I worked for a while at an agency called RGA, where my clients looked more like this, which was a bit more exciting, you know, working for people like Nike and Google, those kind of folks. And now I work at a company called Netlify, who do a variety of kind of CDN management, hosting, infrastructure, automation, tools for developers to make things. So now my clients look more like this, which is, well, I was going to say it was you, but it's actually the other room. So maybe I'm talking to the wrong, I don't know. Hopefully there are some people that this will be interesting to in this room. So when I was working at an agency, that was a difficult kind of environment. And I was a technology director in an agency, and I worked with lots of very creative people. And one of the creative directors had this nickname for me. He'd call me the Dream Crusher, which was lovely. Lovely to have that nickname. In fact, he was so determined that I would crush his dreams. All of his kind of designs weren't realized the way that he'd imagined them, that he actually kind of built me out as a whole kind of super villain, and if you pay attention to it, he did this whole kind of brand exploration of how I would be crushing his dreams. So that's kind, that's generous, and that's kind of tough for anyone who I think is a developer to hear, although we kind of were playing with each other a little bit. But I really like making things. Making things is what excites me, and so I've been building things for the web for about 20 years, and so along the way, working at agencies, working at some of these different places, I've had some different kinds of experiences. And as a result, I've had a few different axes to grind. Stefan talked a little bit about the fact that I've done talks previously about, content management systems. And then when I found that there are ways that, content management systems would pollute the good work that we'd done and then deliver terrible code, I started exploring things like static site generators to try and find a way to do this a little bit better. But those don't sound like very exotic, very exciting talk titles. So for this talk, I kind of wanted to jazz it up a little bit. And so I somehow landed on this as a title. I don't know, it seems pretty bland to me. Next wave infrastructure for an easier life. I could try and fool you that I'm, jazzing it up by adding some colors or adding some kind of clever wordplay, but I don't think anyone would be fooled. But that's okay, because this isn't necessarily a talk that's very exotic or very new, but it's building on some fundamentals that I think we've maybe either forgotten along the way or found hard to do because of the changing way that infrastructure happens. So the reason for this talk is that we kind of learn a lot at conferences. I think this conference has around 150 talks. Wow, that's a lot of content. And I know that we've been learning a lot across the last few days. And I find that the things that we learn, if we confine those just to theory, that's kind of a waste. And if we confine these learnings just to our local development environments, that's a waste as well. That's a real shame. So I think it's just really, really important that the things that we learn reach the eyes of our users and get out into the wild. So that's what this talk is about, really. It's not just about a mindset for doing that, but also a little bit of a look at the process that we can use now that infrastructure has changed. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, great, 40 minutes of a talk about process. That's not necessarily what you came for. But I'll try and make it something that's actionable and something that's relevant and interesting. So this is my strategy for the next 40 minutes. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about where it hurts in software development, where it hurts building projects to go out onto the web. And I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about three stories, three things that I've been through that I've maybe succeeded or failed on, and what I've learned along the way. And then that hopefully will take us to somewhere that we can think about what are the mindsets or what are the resources we can make use of to do a better job with this and to make our lives just a little bit easier. So I'm going to start with where does it hurt? So I don't think it should be a surprise that projects usually involve clients, they involve deadlines, they often involve complexity. As a result, that can often bring us, some sleepless nights. It's difficult, particularly at the end of a project, to be relaxed as developers and people working on these projects. So I just wanted to take a moment just to look at the perfect project timeline. So this will probably be familiar to a lot of people who are building things for the web. We start at the beginning, where hopefully we get some kind of a brief from the client, and then we end at the awards. Any questions on this so far? Everyone's comfortable? Okay, good. Well, the problem is that this would be lovely, but in reality, there is no perfect project timeline. So let's expand on this a tiny bit. So, we haven't done any work yet, so at some point we'll have to start some work. That seems fair. Before we can collect the awards and drink the champagne, we have to, launch something. Before we really know what we're going to start building, we'll need some kind of a scope. We've gone from the brief, we've figured out exactly what we are going to build, how we're going to deliver that. And then before we can actually launch, we're going to have to get the client to sign it off and say, yes, you succeeded on the brief, that's great. Before they do that, they're probably going to want to have some kind of a review, so that's going to happen as well. So with all of these things in place, hopefully we can start building. So we do that, we kind of start typing, we start designing, we start building things and trying to get them out into the world. And then after a little spell of doing some work, that's when we rescope, because that's when we discover some other things that the client actually wanted. So there's a bit of a sweaty palm moment there. And then once after that happens, we've used up some time. So now as we're getting back to work, we're moving a bit faster now. Things are starting to get a bit more chaotic because we want to get to the point that we've got that client review. We do the client review, and then we have to do some more work because it turns out we were building in the wrong place. So we start working a bit more frantically now. These blobs are starting to get closer together and overlap, and our process is really starting to get stretched now, which is why the next build, I don't know why, that doesn't seem right to me. That shouldn't be there for certain. But that's when things are starting to break down. We're not maybe making the things exactly the way we wanted, but that's fine. We're dug in. We're trying to get through to the final sign-off. So the next one's going to be fine. Okay, that's definitely in the wrong place, and it's not the right thing either. It's inexplicably a piece of fruit, and I don't know why that is. So our processes have fallen down a little bit. Now we're going to really pushing through some more work to get through to our final sign-off. We get there. We've had our review. We get our final sign-off, and we can launch. After we realized that it wasn't final sign-off, it was final sign-off. There's just one more thing. And so we do a bit more work, and then we launch, and then we get the awards after we've done some more work to do the fixes. It's difficult. So this is all to say, this is a simplified view of what we're doing, but it all culminates in this thing where launch day is a nerve-wracking moment. I've stolen this completely from MailChimp. I don't know if anyone's ever sent out a big mass email to thousands and thousands of people, but that's what it feels like. And that's what it can feel like on launch day on a project as well. Projects can be hard, we know that. And projects usually involve learning. We don't always have all of the pieces, all of the information at the very beginning. Projects involve change, and how we manage that is kind of key. And so infrastructure has changed over the years, and it's changed how we influence. Its influence on our projects has changed a great deal as well. We've had this kind of evolving approach to infrastructure. So I'm going to draw another one of these timelines. It's not as crazy or terrifying as the last one, thankfully. For once upon a time, we'd have on-site hardware. My first job involved buying racks and buying cooling systems to put servers into rooms and those kind of things to run our 2 websites. But that's changed, of course. We don't do that anymore. Then we got to the point that maybe we'd rent some space in a rack in a catered facility that would have all of the infrastructure there for us, and we'd be literally putting racks into rack space. I don't mean rack space, the company. I mean space in a rack. Later, it would become virtualized, so we'd start to use virtual servers. At that point, it maybe was rack space, but not space in a rack. It's very, very complicated. And then, of course, we kept on marching forward. Software as a service was much more of a thing. And now we've got serverless or functions as a service where we're paying just for the cycle time, just for the invocations of functions that we call. So this is a huge sway over the last 20 years or so. And of course, that has brought with it new deployment conventions, and it's really brought about a very, very, very different approach. And we need to make sure that we keep up to speed with that, because our processes of the old maybe don't quite fit with the new. So projects hurt, when we're managing change, when we're managing the unknowable. Projects always hurt at crunch time, at this end of that horrible project timeline where there's fruit for some reason. It's when the pressure mounts that these things start to fall apart. So what I want to do is kind of get into the stories and kind of bring this to life a little bit and give it some context. So story number one was deploying on my first day. So this is at an agency a few years ago, not RGA, it was one slightly further back into the past, where on the very first day in my new job there as a technology director, the team was deploying a site they'd been working on for a while. It was a large, nationwide health site. So it was a big one. It's one that I didn't want to mess up. And I'd been shown where the coffee was and where the toilets were and those kind of things. And then my new boss said to me this. He said, "Can you help us? Because it should have gone live on Friday. And it was Monday morning, so, tempers were a little frayed. And of course, should have gone live on a Friday does bring about this reaction from me, first of all. But that's a different talk. Let's not worry about that for the moment. His next question was, can you help the team figure out the deployment? I thought, absolutely, let's get stuck in. So if we go back to our timeline and look at how things had worked on here, what they were doing was they were trying to figure out the deployment here, right, on or around launch time. Now, of course, that was never the plan. That was not what they wanted to do from the outset. What they wanted to do was a little bit earlier. They wanted to do it here. So you, like me, have a very similar reaction to that. Ideally, it would have been done sooner, but it's no fun doing that stuff. You're making things, and at some point you're going to have to do a difficult deployment, and you put it off and you put it off, thinking it'll be fine. And when it's not, then things can get tricky. But I want to talk about the deployment process itself for a second, because this is how this works. And some of this will look kind of familiar, I think, to a lot of people. So the way that this was working was that we had to get the site onto a production environment that had been provisioned ahead of time. Currently, the site was residing on a staging environment that the client had been testing against and all those kind of things. Now, some of you may notice that the shape of the site on the staging server and the shape of the site on the production server isn't the same. And that's a problem right away. And the reason it isn't the same is because the deployment process looked like this. It was 2 FTP windows and a developer dragging files from one place to the other and then hitting refresh and then going, nope, and then having another go. And this brought about some sweaty palms for me. I was a bit nervous about this. And so, things weren't quite working out. So what happened next was, Bob, our developer Bob, his name wasn't really Bob, but we'll protect the innocent. So he then started dragging and dropping files from his local machine as well over to the production environment, and that wasn't working. And then Alice got involved on another different environment. And so files were being dragged and dropped from one place to another, and no one knew what the hell was going on by the end of it. And at the root of this, the problem was FTP, which, is a problematic way of doing deployments, frankly, because it can lead to leaving you in an unknowable state. Things are manual, you don't know exactly what's where. And it also, even if you have done this successfully, it's an unrepeatable process. You don't know exactly what steps you took, so it's hard to replicate that faithfully. So we got through it in the end. So a few questions. Did it go live? Yes, it did. I'm proud to let you know it did. Was it correct? Yes, it was correct. It was probably correct. Honestly, I've no way of knowing if it was correct or not. The client signed it off, so that's good. More importantly, how did the next deployment go? Because, of course, we didn't necessarily get it right first time. Who does? I'm not ready to talk about that yet. Do I need a hug? Yes, I do. But that's okay. That's okay. Applause for the hugging. So hugs aside, there are lessons that we can learn from this. So it's not a complete loss. So there are lessons here. So first of all, version control should reach all the way to our deployments, right? So in this agency, version control was being used, but it was kind of being used as a way to store the asset, somewhere to keep things. If it doesn't reach the deployment, then you're not truly versioning all of that. Second lesson I'd say is that human intervention is undesirable in deployments. It turns out we're not very good at doing the same thing over and over again, exactly the same way. the less we can be involved to do manual things, the better. And also the last one, holistic deploys are far preferable to piecemeal deploys. And what I mean by that is, moving things asset by asset is not so good. Ideally, we want a whole site that we can move across and promote to deployment. Okay, I think I need to speed up. Story number 2 is another project called Searching for Syria. Now, this was later in my agency life. This was while I was working at RGA, where we had this project, which was it was kind of for 2 clients, really. It was for Google, who were building this site out, in partnership with the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And so this was a really interesting project because it was about information. It was about sharing, the plight of Syrian refugees, talking about, the people that were affected by that, and just kind of humanizing what was happening there, kind of reminding people, that before things were happening, the top searches on Google were things that, we relate to. It's not such an unusual world. So this is an interesting project, and it's one that, at RGA, we designed this, and then we built this so that it could be deployed for Google. And this is a delicate project. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of change that's likely to happen over the length of that project because, it involves significant political sensitivity, not just in the message, but also in what the perceived message of this might be. When a company like Google wants to build something like this and get this out into the world, some people are going to say, well, what's their agenda? What are they trying to push? Are they trying to sell, Google Drive off the back of this? What's happening? So there had to be a lot of sensitivity about how this was done. Also, there's huge stakeholder diversity in a project like this. I mean, you may have encountered this yourself, where lots of different people are pulling in different directions because they have different things that they need to care about. So that was challenging. And the last part, is it was a global launch. It was going to get a lot of fanfare, be launched into lots of different markets, be touted on the Google homepage, which results in a traffic spike from time to time. So this is one that I wanted to get right, but thankfully I was in from the beginning on this project, different to the last. So if we go back to our timeline again, rather than having, the figuring out of the deployment at this point that we had in our last project we looked at, we wanted to change that completely, and of course we'd do it as close to the start as we possibly could. Through doing that, it meant that every time we were doing a deployment of any version, any iteration throughout the project, way before we deployed it to live, we were testing that process, we were proving it out, which means that some of these kind of outliers can go away. It's still going to get hectic at this side of the project, but that's fine because we've got a process that we've tested with every single deployment. Now, the way that we did this, we built this out on Google Cloud Compute, as you might imagine, when the client was Google, and that worked brilliantly for us. And I'll talk a little bit about why. But the thing to remember is that we had, every site needs to be delivered at some point to the public. But before then, you're likely to need to deliver something to the QA team. You'll need to deliver to the production team, to translation teams who are going to take this, take the content, take it through some translation and localization effort, and then populate the site back into different localizations. We had to deliver, of course, to the client, and for a project like this, the client's bosses wanted to see what was going on as well. And eventually, we had to deliver it to the public. So there's lots of times where we need to surface the work and make sure that people could see it. So the ambition that we had was that we wanted to be able to deliver any version of the site, any version of the build, at any time throughout the process. So that was the goal. And so, as you might imagine, what we used for that was we lent on our old friend version control. And the method we had was that we decided that every time we wanted to tag the build to say this is a good version, that would automatically result in a URL of that version of the site that people could be directed to. And I just want to I reflect on something there, because URLs are the web's superpower. I'm a huge URL nerd. I'm hoping that an event like this, I'm amongst friends. URLs are amazing. But there is one aspect of URLs that I don't like, and you may have encountered this yourself. A friend of mine pointed this out to me. He mentioned that every URL starts with HTTP double meh, and that's really damaging. Once you know that for a fact, and if you can't figure out where that is, there he is. There's our double meh. This doesn't add any value to this talk whatsoever, but it makes me feel better that you now know this as well, because I can't look at URL now without seeing that, and now neither can you. Okay, where were we? We were talking about tags. Okay, So tagging a version of the build would just automatically create a resource that we could hit with the URL. And that's great. Let me show you what that kind of looks like. So again, something that'll look quite familiar. So we've got our builds in our development environments that we ultimately want to get to our production environments. And we're doing everything through version control. So every time we push our changes to Git, or rather when we tag our changes in Git, our continuous integration server, which in this case was Jenkins, would spot that activity in Git, and it would run a build that would output a version of the site to our staging environment. And then at some point we could say, okay, that's good to go, we'll promote that to production. So that's great, because that meant that we had a process that was built on top of our version control. We weren't inventing new processes, and everything kind of worked automatically. We can improve on that a tiny bit there, because we've still got two distinct environments that we might be testing against. So I'm just going to pop over to the Cloud Compute console. So this was App Engine. Now, this isn't actually a screenshot of the project, because I took this after I'd left the company, but it's very, very representative of what we saw. And a bit of interest here is the fact that each of the versions lives on here in the console. So I think the versioning for this particular person who's done this, it looks like a date stamp to me. And at the moment, they've got 100% of the traffic going to the top one. But all of the other versions live on. And that's key, because it means that you can start to route traffic to whichever version you like, and they're all there within the same environment. So rather than having this situation, we've actually got this. We've got one environment which we're testing against, we're seeing works, and then within that, we've got different instances of the site, different versions of the site, and we can dictate at any time which one is live. You know, new changes come in, we're testing those there in the environment, and then we're happy that they're good to go. We'll make that latest one the live one, and so it goes on. So that kind of simplifies the environments that we're testing against, and that's fantastic. That's really liberating. And the other thing I'd say about that is it means that all of the demonstrations, all of the discussions, the tests, the issues that are being raised, and the sign-off that happens, all of those happen against known versions of the site, because each one has an address in the URL that's linked to the version. That's huge. Okay, so lessons from this. Addressable and accessible build versions are a huge win, just in terms of visibility and knowing what you're testing against. Also, deciding when and what to tag requires some coordination. Now, this was something that I think maybe we could have improved on, because who decides what's a good version and ready to go? There's things that we could maybe improve there. But the last one, and probably the biggest one, is that immutable deploys to a real production environment remove so much uncertainty from launch day, because we're not deploying to a new environment. We're just saying, okay, that's no longer the live one, that's the live one, and they're within the same environment. So having these immutable deploys that don't change and you're just pointing pointers to is a wonderful thing for that kind of sweaty palms, press the go button moment on launch day. Okay, story number 3. Netlify building Netlify. Now, this is a much more recent story. I joined Netlify at the end of last year, and it was good because I joined there at a time when there was a bit of a refresh going on our own website. So I got to see some of the processes being applied to ourselves. So just to describe what Netlify.com, the website, is, Netlify.com is a JAMstack site hosted on Netlify using Netlify to Netlify. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Now, I know that I'm using one word for a noun and a verb, and I'm doing all kinds of silly things there. Let me try and explain that a tiny bit. So this is the situation we had on our previous example, looking at the Google project, and that was working quite nicely. Netlify does things kind of similar to this, but the continuous integration is part of like the Netlify suite. So rather than having to have Jenkins running, now Netlify itself watches Git and will run your build and then deploy it to the Netlify CDN. And that's kind of similar in other respects to the situation we saw before. This is great when this is all in one thing, because it means that now we've got a Git-based workflow all the way to production, right? So everything from end to end is based on activity in Git. That's great. That really helps us. I also threw in another term there. I called it a JAMstack site, and some of you might be saying, well, what's that? I maybe have heard that term, or that's completely new to me. So JAMstack is a phrase or an expression that's starting to kind of gain a bit of popularity, and the jam in there is JavaScript, APIs, and markup. You could maybe describe it, a lot of people are thinking about this as like another way of referring to static sites, but I think it's a bit more than that because there's a whole ecosystem at play here rather than just a site that sits there kind of dormant. So I'm just going to unpack this a tiny bit so it makes more sense for the next section here. So when we're looking at a JAMstack environment, we're looking at a build environment that runs locally or on your local machine, and that might be taking markup and maybe other front-end assets, maybe some JavaScript as well, and it's running in a build, whether that's a JavaScript-based build or using a make script or something else, that outputs a static asset that can be deployed to a CDN, so your site is something that can be deployed anywhere. The APIs part of that, of course, is that when you run your build, you might be pulling in content from content APIs like Contentful or Headless CMS, those kind of things, or it might be getting data from other places like pricing engines, like digital asset management systems. All kinds of things are possible. But the key is that it's going through this build process and then giving you an atomic kind of static asset that you can put somewhere on a deployment. Now, there also might be JavaScript running on the client, of course. That might be something you bundle up, and then client side, JavaScript is making requests to APIs as well. That's a possibility as well, and that can bring sites to life. And that's quite a well-worn model now, where we can start to simplify our infrastructure a little bit by moving these parts around. And I'm going to talk about that a tiny bit more, because in a Netlify's case, yes, the website was this piece, but Netlify's product is a bunch of APIs and a bunch of infrastructure behind it. What we're talking about here is the UI, this piece that's statically built out. And so the nice thing here in this environment is that all of the builds are based on Git commits. So we have a history. I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So this is my console for my load of different sites on Netlify. If I go into the website and I go and look at the build, the deploy tab, what I should have here is a list of lots of different deploys. One of them's failed there, you can see, and there's different versions of builds. And if I go into one in particular, that'll show me, I could look at the deploy log, but we'll skip over that for the moment. It's actually linked directly to the Git event that triggered this build, so we can actually just track back and see what has changed on this particular build, which is a lovely thing to have. But then also, when we look at the build itself, so we've gone to the site that's been generated here. One of the things that might be just kind of hard to see, I'm sorry it's a little bit small if you're at the back, the URL for that is a unique URL. There's a hash in there which is unique to that Git event, that push that triggered the build, and that lives on forever. These are all immutable. So that's a wonderful thing. It means that now we'd be able to roll backwards and forwards through the different deploys that had happened over time and promote different things to production should we want to. So that's nice. It's kind of similar to some of the environment we looked at in the Google environment, but it looks a little bit differently. But to bring some more context to this, the UI that we're looking at, this part on the right that we just saw a versioned deployment of, that's talking to an API in the background through JavaScript. And that means that over time, you can roll forward and back different versions of your UI if we maybe had any problems. And what I've done here is I've taken a look at Netlify over the last few years. So these are screenshots that were taken quite recently, but I just looked at the deployment of an earlier version. And this is all functional. This is like the same list of sites and the same kind of configuration page, talking to the same API and completely functional, but with a different version of the UI. There it is, a year later, and then later again still. So it's incredibly liberating to have this flexibility to roll forward and back through versions of your UI. You probably wouldn't move back quite so dramatically, I think, as maybe I've done there. But nonetheless, that's quite a superpower. And that comes from decoupling some of these things and then managing just very specific parts of your infrastructure. Also, I mentioned that all of the automation is based on Git activity, and we can also start to do things based on pull requests. That gets kind of interesting when you're thinking about how you use Git in your infrastructure. So what I'm looking at here, and again, it's going to be a little bit hard to see because it's a little bit small, but I'll try and describe it properly. This is a pull request for a bit of a change to our blog, and I'm just going to pause it there for a second because this is the discussion that's happening on GitHub. And the notification you can see down at the bottom from Very Thorough, who's our documentation engineer, that's actually been done automatically because what's happened was when the pull request was created, the system recognized that, saw that, and fired off a build. And that build pulled the pull request into a new version of the site merged it, built that out, and then deployed it. And so that is completely standalone from the production environment. But what it means is that we've got a view of what the site will look like were we to decide to merge that pull request. So in a way, we're kind of looking into the future a little bit, which I really, really like. So I'll skip through a bit faster here. So we end up with the fact that we've got our production environment and our staging environment next to each other. One is the preview build just based off a pull request. This is really nice because it means that we've got real confidence in the future state of what we're going to deploy. And that just kind of gives us a much more robust way of getting things out into the world. Now, I mentioned about 20 minutes ago that version control should reach all the way to your deployments, and I stand by it. But I also showed this slide as well, which talked about lots of different bits of infrastructure, and there's this one at the end, the functions as a service. Things like serverless functions like Lambda on AWS, or Google have Google Cloud Functions, Azure have something similar. Now this is code that lives on someone else's infrastructure and is kind of decoupled from our core site, our static site that we might be pushing. So how do we make all of that all fit together? Let me ask a question. Have many people played with serverless functions and used Lambda? Can I have a little show of hands? There's a collection of, like a smattering of people. Did it go smoothly? Was it easy or was it difficult? I don't know how you're expected to respond to that, but I'm going to respond for you. Was it difficult? Was it fiddly? Yes? Yes, why not? It's a big room, no one's dissenting. I find that it can be difficult. I find that there's huge power there, but it's difficult to get it set up correctly, get the permissioning done correctly, expose things over URL and all of those things. So I wanted to show you an approach that we've got here to try and bring that all under one roof. So this is an example which I'll go through quite quickly. This is going to be deploying a React site. So this is based on top of like the canonical Hello World example of create React app. But this is a variant that also includes some Lambda functions. So I'm just going to roll this ahead. So this is the GitHub repo for it. I'll send a link to this later on. And I just clicked a little button on there, and it was a deploy to Netlify button. And what that did was it fired off, I'm going to keep pausing it. So it's actually triggered a build on Netlify. It's done two things. It's asked for permission to clone that repository into your own GitHub repository, into your own GitHub account. That was the little box that popped up there and asked permission. And now once it's done that, I can give that a name and say, okay, save that repository and deploy it. So two things are happening there now. That repository is being cloned into my GitHub account, and at the same time, a new site is being instantiated in Netlify, which is bound to that Git project. What's happening now is that Netlify has gone and grabbed the code in that Git repository. I'm going to pause it for a second. It's checked out that code. It's seen the dependencies in a package.json file, and it's installed those dependencies, and then it's run the build. Once it's run the build, it's gone green, and now we've got a live site on a new URL, which is from that repository. So that's great. We've gone from 0 to a live site deployed in just a few seconds. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the network tab, because the thing that's different to just the Hello World Lambda, React app here is that we've got a little button which is a call Lambda. And when I click that, it calls a function that was also deployed to AWS for us. So you'll notice that we didn't do anything there to go and configure anything in AWS. I never left this environment, but we've done the deployment to AWS as well behind the scenes. So I'm going to show you what the code looks like for that, and then we're going to fork it, we're going to change it, we'll deploy a new version. So if we go over to the repository, which you'll see now is in my GitHub repository with our new repo that we've created, and we'll dig in now to the code. We'll go to the Lambda folder here. Now what we've got in here is as many JavaScript files as we like. Each file there, however it's named, that will yield a URL that's been deployed onto AWS Lambda that we can hit by that URL. So Netlify does all of that kind of brokering for you. So we look at the code for this, make it a little bit bigger, I think, so you can hopefully see that. This is the simplest possible Lambda I could come up with. And so you can see, maybe if you squint, that all it does when it just returns the hello world message. But what we'll do is, just in this environment, of course we could be doing this locally in our local dev environment, but we'll do it here in GitHub. We'll change what this function is. So we'll say, hello, we are developers instead. We'll save that. And then what we'll do is we'll create a pull request from that with a button off the screen. So this is creating a pull request, and I'll write a very descriptive message. Oh, no, I won't. Oops. And create the pull request. And now what's happening is that if I've seen that and it's starting a build-up, so that's going to be triggered as you saw before in the previous example. But that's also doing the same thing for your Lambda functions. So now we can see the build is happening. You maybe go and take a look at the logs that are happening, and dependencies were already installed previously, so we just got those cached. Things are being pushed to AWS. And in a second, once Webpack has done its thing, deploying the site is live, boom. Okay, so now we should be able to go to our deploy preview that we created from that. Again, I'm just going to pause it. You can just about see the URL deploy preview 1, because that's my first pull request. And now when I hit that button, I get a different response. Now that's a versioned API being deployed to Lambda without you ever needing to go anywhere near it. We'll also see that our production version is still the same. You know, they live next to each other. So now we've got instantly a staging environment as production, including all the way through to AWS Lambda. I guess just for sanity, we'll finish this process by saying, okay, we'll merge that pull request now. Everyone's happy with the thing that we saw staged on that environment, so now we'll get it deployed. So I've merged it, and now we've got another build kicking off. Now it's against master, because that's where the activity is. So in a second, that build should finish. I think I get impatient here and then go into it. There we go. And that's now complete. So now if we go to, so we refresh our production version and hit the Lambda. Okay, now we've got our new version in there. So it doesn't seem like we're doing a lot there, but there's a ton of stuff happening behind the scenes to simplify things. This is a serverless workflow that I think kind of works, which is powered by version control actions already. We're not inventing new processes of zipping things up, moving them around, anything like that. It's just happening based on top of Git. It automatically creates these versioned lambdas, which are immutable in the same way that we saw in the site earlier on. So we could step forward and back through any version of the site, and that would be working against versioned lambdas. They're all immutable, so again, we can step back and forward. And we're getting this instant provisioning of as many staging environments as we like. So that lives on through the site and on through the serverless as well. Okay, so there's a bunch of things kind of crammed in there. Let's look at some lessons. Embracing version control conventions just removes the need to reinvent them. I've worked in lots of environments where the process of deploying something, we kind of ape the conventions that already exist in Git. If we just build on top of that and let the actions in Git trigger things, that can be really powerful. This reduced friction in doing a deployment where it should be trivial to do a deploy, that just brings all kinds of agility and confidence, and just knowing that you can do many builds an hour and you can move backwards and forwards, that's a really liberating thing. And also this kind of notion of static sites, this kind of JAMstack model, when you decouple the APIs from the front end, this can go a lot further than just what we think of as static sites. React-based UIs like Netlify.com itself are built on top of that. Okay. So don't worry, we don't still have another 14 minutes. We're not starting again. I wanted to get on in the last few minutes to mindset and resources. So there's lots of different ways that we can do continuous integration. Many have come across Jenkins already, I'm sure. Circle CI is another good one to look for, which is a software as a service version of continuous integration. Also, there's tons of information here in this site that Chris Coyer put together. I don't know if anyone's come across this, the power of serverless.info, which looks at this evolution into slightly different types of infrastructure and some of the tools and resources that live around that. I'd recommend taking a look at that as well. And since we're on that theme, there's another great site called The New Dynamic, which has lots of great writings about these kind of approaches, which I think is useful, along with jamstack.org. But mostly I just wanted to wrap up with this kind of thing about the mindset. I think you've probably got the hint already that I'm into URLs and I'm into version control. Version control for everything is the key, I think, here. The further it can reach, the safer you're going to be. A little note on deployment. I think when we're doing our deployments, it's really important to make it scripted so that we get the meat out of the process as much as possible, get the people out of there, script it as much as we can, and base it on top of actions that are already happening so that you can automate it as well. So make it scripted, make it automated, make it real so that it's actually impacting a production environment and not just an environment which is, just a temporary thing. Whenever you can make the production environment the same as the environment you use early, that's a great boon as well. And make it first. The sooner you can make it, the better. All right, so I think we're always going to expect times of chaos on a project. That timeline that we had for the project timeline, there's always trouble at this end. That's just the way it goes. But we shouldn't let our processes and the infrastructure that we use that brings about some of these processes be the things that create that chaos. It's an awfully full stack for developers these days. There's a lot to happen just in front end alone, let alone everywhere else. So I think it's fine these days to use the skills of others. Think about how we can break apart our architectures to make use of things like microservices and other things that people can do for us that we can leverage. That's a really empowering thing. That's it. I do have a few minutes left, but that's all. Thank you so much for listening and for being in this room and not one of the others. Thank you for that. The slides are there for you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, I do have a few minutes.
We do have a couple of minutes, so let's see if there are any questions.
I said that there'd be no time for Q&A. We have got a few minutes. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can grab me afterwards. So it's totally up to you.
This is a wonderful question. We do one question, and then we segue into the break. What are the technologies behind Netlify? What does Netlify run on?
So Netlify is built. It's a fairly complex architecture behind the scenes that you don't need to worry about, thankfully. But it uses Kubernetes, and all of the builds are kind of containerized, so they're all independent of each other. But there's also a CDN that's built out, which is C++ and a few other bits and pieces. There's deep engineering that I don't go anywhere near. I'm not smart enough. I sit at the consumer side of it and make use of it on top. In terms of what kind of technologies you can use on it, the builds you can run are pretty much anything. Think of it kind of similar in some ways to something like a GitHub Pages, where it would be listening to Git and then it would run Jekyll, but you can run like any tooling you like on that. So it's pretty broad. It's pretty broad. Should we go for another one?
Saying your CDN is pretty fast as well.
The CDN is pretty fast.
Hellish fast.
Yeah.
Maybe the next one, how do you handle different database versions?
How do you handle different database versions when switching live environments? That's a great question. And so this comes down to, first of all, do you have a database? Because there are lots of different stacks where you actually don't need a database, but let's assume that you do, and that comes down to API versioning. So we've kind of fragmented these two things. We've split these apart, so the front end is abstracted from the back end. So certainly over time you might find the database evolves and the API evolves. Having a versioned API is key to being able to have good separation of those concerns, and so that's the best piece of advice I think I can give for that.
Okay, so thank you very much, Phil. Thanks for the amazing talk. Have a big round of applause for Phil.
Thanks very much. Thank you.